He did not know that he would survive this march, that he would one day reunite with his father in the same village, and that decades later he would stand before the Japanese-American soldiers who pulled him from the snow, tears finally falling, to thank them. Around him, men dropped and did not rise. The guards shot anyone who stumbled. Solly kept crawling because stopping meant dying, and some stubborn ember of life still burned behind his ribs. He did not know that American soldiers were closing in from the west. He did not know they were Japanese-American soldiers, men who looked like the enemies his captors had allied with, and he could not have imagined that they were about to become his saviors. On the morning of May 2nd, 1945, soldiers of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion rolled into the village of Waukirchen in southern Bavaria. What they found there stopped them cold. Hundreds of walking skeletons drifted aimlessly through the streets, their eyes sunk deep into jaundiced sockets, their skin stretched tight over bones that seemed ready to break through. Some were too far gone to move. They lay in the mud, breathing shallowly, waiting. The Nisei artillerymen climbed down from their trucks and stood in silence. How do you bear witness to the absolute bottom of human cruelty and then simply carry on? The orders came down fast and hard. Do not give them your rations. Their stomachs have shrunk to the size of walnuts. Solid food will kill them. Only small amounts of soup at first, nothing more. The medics explained it, but the soldiers still had to stand there while skeletal hands reached toward them, while hollow eyes pleaded without words. Some of the survivors crawled toward the garbage sumps and fought over potato peels. Some grabbed crusts of bread and swallowed them whole. Over the next few days, while the United States Army scrambled to set up shelters and field kitchens, hundreds more of the liberated inmates died. They died from exposure. They died because their bodies could not process the food that well-meaning soldiers slipped them when nobody was looking. The Nisei watched it happen and could do nothing. They had crossed an ocean, survived the Vosges Mountains, broken the Gothic line, and now they stood helpless before men whose only enemy was starvation itself. The emaciated faces of those Dachau survivors would never leave them. For the rest of their lives, the veterans of the 522nd would remember the way bony fingers curled around empty air, the way death came quietly in the night and took men who had already been reduced to shadows. It was the final revelation of a war that had already shown them too much, and it was not over yet. 5 days later, at 41 minutes past 2 in the morning, a German colonel general named Alfred Jodl walked into a small red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France. He sat down across from Allied representatives and signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces. The Third Reich was over. In London, tens of thousands poured into Trafalgar Square. In Paris, French civilians danced down the Champs-Élysées with American and British soldiers. The news reached the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in northern Italy that same night. The regiment was bivouacked at Novi Ligure, on the southern edge of the Po Valley, and it was Chaplain Hiro Higuchi who heard it first. He was in the communications tent late at night when the bulletin crackled through. He asked his commanding officer for permission to address the men as soon as the news could be confirmed. The following morning, Higuchi mounted a platform before the 2nd Battalion. The men were confused at first. It was not Sunday. The chaplain did not usually address them like this except for worship. He asked them to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." The familiar words rose into the Italian sky. Then Higuchi told them the truth. The war in which all our friends who slept with us and ate and died and wanted to see this day, the war is over. No one cheered. A soft, collective exhalation rippled through the ranks, like wind passing over a field of wheat. Higuchi looked down at the upturned faces. Tears dribbled down sun-browned cheeks. These men had charged machine gun nests and climbed vertical cliffs under mortar fire. Now they wept silently. He asked them to take a minute for silent prayer, not to celebrate their own deliverance, but to think of the men who were not there, to think of the mothers at home who would never see their sons return. When he dismissed them, a handful of replacement troops threw their hats in the air and shouted, the ones who had not seen any fighting, the ones who had not lost any friends, the ones who had never held a dying comrade while his blood soaked into foreign soil. The rest of the battalion simply walked back to their assigned tasks. Nobody got out ukuleles, nobody danced hula. They were happy it was over, but their faces remained hard and distant. Private Fred Shiosaki of K Company was in the 3rd Battalion bivouac area when the news reached him. He had been through too much to cheer. The Lost Battalion rescue, the Gothic Line cliffs. Too many friends buried in Italian cemeteries, too many bloody dreams, he thought. Geez, well, I made it. I think I made it. Then he walked back to the stone schoolhouse where he was billeted and took a nap. Shiosaki's exhaustion was not physical alone. Every night since the Vosges, he had woken in darkness with the images still burning behind his eyelids. German machine gun fire cutting through trees. The screams of wounded men on Hill 140. The moment he thought a shell fragment had killed him, and he said goodbye to his mother in his mind. The war in Europe was over, but the war inside his head had barely begun. Up in Germany, Sergeant Katsugo Miho and the rest of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion received the news with the same weary relief. Miho had been with the unit since Camp Shelby. He had watched his own brother buried in Mississippi before the regiment even shipped out. He had fired his howitzer through the Vosges, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Bavaria. Like Shiosaki, like all of them, he could not summon the energy to celebrate. But a curious change came over the artillerymen that week. For months they had driven their trucks with wild abandon, racing down the autobahns at breakneck speed, careening through narrow village streets. Now something shifted. When they climbed into the backs of the trucks, the men pounded on the cabs and shouted at the drivers, "Take it easy, we want to go home." They had fought like samurai, expecting to die. Now suddenly, they wanted to live. That desire to survive the peace was new and fragile. Many of the Buddha heads, the Hawaiian soldiers, had carried their father's warrior code into battle. They had genuinely not expected to return. But now they let themselves imagine it. The taste of their mother's cooking, the touch of a girlfriend's hand, the warm sand of the beaches they had played on as children. They did not want some careless driver to swerve off a road and steal all of that away in the final hour. On May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. Across America, church bells rang and people poured into the streets. In New York, the largest crowd in the city's history jammed Times Square. Sailors kissed strangers. Men climbed lampposts waving flags. But for every American who celebrated that day, there was a caveat printed in boldface in the Associated Press dispatch. The war against Japan continued. The moment they were all waiting for still lay somewhere in the future, across the vast emptiness of the Pacific. The 442nd loaded into truck convoys and moved east toward the sprawling Getty airfield near Milan. Their new assignment was processing German prisoners of war. More than 85,000 of them. The Germans came in dirty and malnourished, many sick, some still wearing the haunted expressions of men who had watched their world collapse. It was strange, almost surreal, to see their former enemies reduced to this. Fred Shiosaki spent long, hot days searching the prisoners and confiscating whatever loot they had stolen from Italian homes. Then he dusted them from head to foot with DDT powder to kill the lice. He released them into a large stockade where they would wait for further interrogation and eventual repatriation. The work was tedious and dirty. Shiosaki did it without complaint. He had seen too much to feel much pity for these men, but he had also seen too much to feel much hatred. Meanwhile, the 522nd moved to the town of Donauwörth, northwest of Munich. Their task was guarding a pontoon bridge over the Danube and searching for SS officers hiding among the thousands of displaced persons streaming across the river. Every day brought new faces: Polish laborers, French prisoners, Russian soldiers who had been starved and worked nearly to death. The scale of the humanitarian catastrophe was beyond anything the young Nisei had ever imagined. Katsugo Miho and his comrades found small compensations in the tedium. One of Germany's finest breweries stood near their base, and they filled 25-gallon rubberized canvas bags with fresh beer. They hung these bags in strategic locations throughout their quarters. At any time of day or night, a man could fill his canteen with some of the best beer in Bavaria. It was a small pleasure, but after what they had witnessed at Waakirchen, small pleasures were everything. As the summer dragged on, the first soldiers finally began to rotate out. The ones who had been with the 100th Battalion since the fall of 1943, who had fought all the way up the Italian peninsula from Salerno. Then the original 442nd men who had arrived in Italy the following summer. Each departure was a small tear in the fabric of the regiment, a reminder that this strange, intense brotherhood was dissolving. The goodbyes were harder than any of them had anticipated. They had trained together under the Mississippi sun, had survived the frozen Vosges together, had climbed the cliffs of the Gothic line together. They had watched each other die and held each other when the dying was done. Whatever else life held for them now, nothing would ever equal the intensity of what they had shared. They would likely never love anyone in quite the same way they loved one another. The ship home was still months away for most of them. A point system governed the order of discharge, based on length of service, number of dependents, and honors received in battle. For some, the boat ride back to the States would not come for another year and a half. In the meantime, they guarded bridges and deloused prisoners and tried not to think too much about the faces they had seen at Waakirchen, or the friends sleeping under white crosses on foreign soil. Fred Shiosaki finally got his orders and climbed aboard a Liberty ship in Livorno. The vessel was old and slow, and quarters were so tight he had to bunk with the crew. The crossing took more than 20 days through monstrous North Atlantic seas. Shiosaki shared meals with the merchant sailors, eating meat that had turned rancid and biscuits crawling with black weevils. He did not complain. After 2 years of combat, he had finally found his sea legs and never once felt queasy. But his mind was still raw, still churning with the images of German machine gun positions and frozen foxholes in the Vosges forest. He arrived in Newport News on Christmas Eve. From there he boarded a train to Washington, D.C., watching the winter landscape slide past the window. The flat fields of Virginia gave way to the outskirts of the capital. He sat alone with his thoughts, remembering Anzio and Hill 140, remembering the face of the young replacement soldier who had died in the foxhole beside him. At Union Station in Washington, D.C., a soldier wearing the patch of the Texas Division approached him. The man pointed at Shiosaki's 442nd shoulder patch and said, "Hey, you were with the 442nd. Were you at the Lost Battalion?" Shiosaki nodded. The Texan extended his hand and thanked him, but Shiosaki stared at the hand and turned away. He looked out a window and said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? Do you know how many of my friends died in there?" He was not ready to shake that hand. On January 4th, he boarded a military transport bound for Fort Lewis, south of Seattle. 2 days later, he walked through the door of the Hilliard Laundry. The warm, familiar smell of steam and soap enveloped him. His mother and sister screamed in delight and wrapped their arms around him. His father, Kisaburo, stepped forward, shook his hand, and looked him in the eye. "You did well," he said. Then he walked to the front of the laundry and took down the blue service star that had hung in the window since 1943. 3 weeks later, a young private named Rudy Tokiwa limped off a bus in San Jose, California. He was still hobbling on crutches from the wounds he had taken on Monte Folgorito. The Poston camp had been closed and no one could tell him where his parents had gone. It was as if every Japanese-American family had simply vanished into the vast interior of the country. He began making phone calls to friends in Salinas, but nobody knew anything. At the bus station, he spotted a young woman at a Red Cross stand set up to aid returning soldiers. He approached the booth and asked for help finding his parents, explaining that they had been held in one of the concentration camps and that the camps were now closed. The woman finally turned around and looked at him. She studied him for a moment and said, "There is a place on 5th Street. A bunch of Japs are living there." A sailor standing behind Tokiwa in line pushed his way forward. He pointed at the ribbons on Tokiwa's chest and demanded, "Are you calling this man a Jap? Do you see his ribbons? He fought overseas. Who do you think you are?" The sailor leaned over the counter and slapped the woman across the face. Tokiwa grabbed his arm and said, "Oh no, we don't want to cause trouble. All I am doing is trying to find where my parents are." He stopped the confrontation right there. Then he took a cab to the Buddhist church on 5th Street. The driver said nothing. Tokiwa climbed the stairs to a small room on the 2nd floor, his crutches thumping on each step, and there, in a cramped attic space, he found them. His father looked him over, remaining seated, and asked if his wounds were bad. Tokiwa assured him he would be all right. His mother Fusa leaped up and draped her arms around him. She did not cry as he had expected. Instead, she murmured, "Kami-sama has awarded this to me, for what I have done." Tokiwa did not understand. She explained that every morning at Poston before dawn, she had risen in the darkness and poured buckets of cold water over her body, praying to the gods to bring her son home. It had looked foolish, she said, but you do everything a mother can do when your son is at war. The last Hawaiian soldiers came home on a January morning in 1946. Sergeant Katsugo Miho stood at the rail of the MS John Ericsson as Diamond Head rose out of the darkness just before dawn. His parents were somewhere on the pier below, waiting under a nearly full moon. No hula dancers greeted this battered transport, only a few newspaper photographers who had long since stopped covering routine arrivals. Miho lifted his duffel bag onto his shoulder and walked down the gangway into the warm tropical breeze. He was back on Oahu, but the boy who had walked out of Atherton House on the morning of December 7th was gone. 3 days later, Miho walked onto the campus of the University of Hawaii and tried to pick up where he had left off. He could not focus. The words in his textbooks blurred into memories of German machine gun fire and the faces of Dachau survivors. He was failing 4 of his 5 classes by the end of the first semester. He spent his evenings in the steamy back room of the Owl Cafeteria on Merchant Street, shooting pool with other veterans. It felt more important to be with his boys than to sit in a library. They talked story. They laughed. They never spoke about what they had seen in the Vosges or on the Gothic line. Then something shifted in his second semester. The old imperative to organize, to lead, to make things happen, it flickered back to life. Miho buckled down and lashed himself to his studies. He created a veterans club on campus and became its manager. He organized a university-wide carnival. By his senior year, he was class president again. The same restless energy that had driven him at Maui High now channeled into the struggle to become a civilian. Law school beckoned on the East Coast, and he took it, using the GI Bill. At George Washington University in the capital, Miho fell in with other Nisei veterans who had the same idea. A young second lieutenant named Daniel Inoue was there, his empty sleeve pinned to his jacket, also studying law. Spark Matsunaga was there. John Ushijima. More than 24 Hawaiian Nisei crammed into law schools in Washington, and they shared dinner together at least once a week. They were not just learning torts and contracts, they were planning quietly to take back the islands from the plantation owners who had ruled them for a century. Miho passed the bar, returned to Honolulu, and joined his brother Katsuro's law firm. The halls of power were opening, and he walked through them. Within a decade, Miho stood on the platform in front of Iolani Palace as the first legislature of the new state of Hawaii convened. Dancers swayed on the lawn below as the Honolulu Police choral group sang. Miho wore a massive red lei and remembered the day he had stood on this same lawn in a khaki uniform, waiting to be shipped overseas. He would serve 5 terms in the State House. Governor John Burns would later appoint him a family court judge. He would found the 442nd Veterans Club in Honolulu and devote decades to public service. But the nightmares never entirely left him, nor did the faces of the men who had not come home. The second front of the Nisei War had begun, and it was being fought in courtrooms, classrooms, and legislative chambers. 3,000 miles to the east, Private Rudy Tokiwa fought that second front from a wheelchair. The shrapnel still lodged in his body shifted as the years passed, causing sieges of pain so excruciating that he landed in an iron lung at one point. 9 pieces of metal were eventually cut out of him. He was hobbled, but he was never idle. He became Western Regional Director of the Boy Scouts of America. He served in the PTA. He married, fathered 4 children, divorced, and eventually settled in with a speech pathologist named Judy Niyazawa, who had been born in the Amasha camp in Colorado. And in 1987, when it was time to storm Capitol Hill for redress, he strapped on his crutches and joined the assault. 120 Japanese-American activists fanned out through the marble corridors of Congress that year, many of them veterans. They approached this mission with the same go-for-broke spirit they had carried up Monte Folgorito. Tokiwa and a contingent of Nisei entered the office of Congressman Charles Edward Bennett of Florida, a decorated veteran who had fought the Japanese in the steaming jungles of New Guinea and had contracted polio there. He walked on leg braces and crutches. When he saw the Japanese faces in his office, he erupted. "What the hell are you sons of bitches doing in my office?" he demanded. The other men began to back out, but Tokiwa lingered. Bennett gestured for him to leave. Instead, Tokiwa approached him on his crutches. "Sir, I just want to thank you," he said, sticking out his hand. Bennett snarled that he was not going to do a damn thing for them. Tokiwa did not flinch. He told Bennett he knew about the leg braces and the polio. He knew the man woke up every morning hurting like a son of a bitch. And even with all that pain, Tokiwa said the congressman still got up and helped run the government. He told Bennett he was a good man, and he shook his hand. On the day the redress bill came to a vote, Bennett was scheduled to deliver a 3-minute speech opposing it. He walked into the well of the House, hesitated, then turned and walked out a side door without saying a word. When the tally appeared on the display, Bennett had voted yes. Tokiwa found him in his office afterward. Bennett looked at the veteran on crutches and said something that was half laugh, half surrender. What the hell was he supposed to do? He asked. He had looked up and seen Tokiwa on those goddamned crutches. The measure passed, and on August 10, 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. Its language was blunt. The incarcerations were motivated by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It provided $20,000 to each surviving detainee. It was a victory finally on the second front. Fred Shiosaki watched this fight from Spokane, where he had built a quiet life. He earned a degree in chemistry from Gonzaga, married a bright young woman named Lily Nakai, and became the city chemist. He grew enormous pumpkins in his son's garden and gave them away to neighborhood children at Halloween. On winter mornings, he fly fished the same lakes his father had taken him to as a boy. His own father, Kisaburo, had died of cancer in 1958, but Tori survived until 1977, long enough to see her son appointed chairman of the State Ecological Commission. The nightmares had faded over the years, though Shiosaki seldom spoke of the war to his own children. He was, as he once described himself, a 6'8" lumberjack living in a 5'6" body. The Second Front never really ended, but the men who had liberated Bruyères and rescued the lost battalion were finally beginning to feel like Americans. The post-war decades had forced them to fight for that too. In Edmonton, Alberta, Gordon Hirabayashi lived a quiet life. He was a retired sociology professor now, his hair white, his voice still steady when someone asked him about the war years. 4 decades had passed since he walked out of McNeil Island Penitentiary and into a world that was only beginning to understand what it had done to him. He still spoke at universities and Quaker meetings about the Constitution and the cost of silence. He had never stopped believing that the law must protect everyone, or it protected no one. Across the country, other men who had been young in 1944 were also growing old. A quiet campaign had been building for years. Veterans groups and historians pored over battle reports, Medal of Honor citations, and unit diaries. The numbers did not lie. The 442nd had earned more than 4,000 Purple Hearts and 560 Silver Stars, yet only one man from the entire regiment had ever received the nation's highest award for valor. His name was Sadao Munamori. He threw himself on a grenade on Monte Folgorito to shield 2 comrades and died instantly. His mother accepted the medal alone in 1946. 54 years later, on a bright June morning in the year 2000, the injustice was finally corrected. 20 aging veterans and the families of soldiers long dead gathered at the White House. Some walked with canes, some sat in wheelchairs. President Clinton stepped to the podium and looked out at them. He spoke words that cut through half a century of silence. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-served. Then, one by one, the citations were read aloud. Second Lieutenant Daniel Inoue received his medal for an assault in Tuscany where he lost his right arm and kept fighting. James Okubo was honored for running through machine gun fire in the Vosges forest to drag wounded men to safety until his own hands bled. Ted Tanue, who had led the charge up Hill 140 near Castellina, was killed in action shortly after. His family accepted the award in his place. Behind each name was a specific moment of physical courage that had been ignored because of race. When the final medal was pinned that morning, the statistical reality of the 442nd sacrifice became undeniable. 21 Medals of Honor, 4.4% of all the nation's highest awards, earned by just over 0.1% of the military force. No unit of comparable size in American history had ever received more decorations. The ceremony was not just a correction of the record, it was a public acknowledgement that the Nisei soldiers had been fighting 2 wars simultaneously, and they had won them both. Far from the cameras and the marble halls of Washington, Fred Shiosaki tended his garden in Spokane. He had retired from the city chemist's office years ago and now spent his mornings in the rich black soil of his son's backyard. Every October he grew enormous pumpkins and gave them to the neighborhood children for jack-o'-lanterns. On winter mornings he drove to the same lakes his father Kisaburo had taken him to as a boy. He stood in the cold water with a fly rod in his hand and did not think about the war. He had earned that silence. In the San Francisco Bay Area, Rudy Tokiwa was still fighting. His body had never stopped paying for Monte Folgorito. The shrapnel that shifted over the decades, the 9 pieces surgeons eventually cut out, the wheelchair he used when the pain became too great to stand, none of it silenced him. He visited schools and spoke to teenagers about what it meant to be American. He told them about the barbed wire at Poston and the climb up the Gothic line and the friends who never came home. It doesn't make no difference what you look like, he would say. It's what you've done for the country that counts. In Honolulu, Judge Katsugo Miho was dying. It was September of 2011. An aide wheeled an old man with one empty sleeve into the hospital room. Daniel Inoue had come to say goodbye. The 2 veterans who had shared dinner once a week in a cramped Washington apartment while studying law together sat together one last time. They had helped build a new Hawaii. They had dragged the islands from plantation feudalism into statehood. Now one of them was leaving. Miho died on September 11th. He was buried at the Punch Bowl, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, not far from where his brother Katsuaki and so many of his comrades lay. The governor ordered flags across Hawaii flown at half-staff. On the lawn of Iolani Palace, where Miho had once stood as a young khaki-clad soldier waiting to ship overseas, and later as an elected representative of a brand new state, the silence was complete. By the end of 2011, the men who had crawled up the backside of Folgorito and broken through the Vosges forest were vanishing one by one. Fred Shiosaki still fly-fished the cold lakes of eastern Washington. Rudy Tokiwa still told his story to anyone who would listen. Gordon Hirabayashi still spoke about the Constitution from his home in Alberta. The generation that had proved its loyalty under fire was nearing its end. What remained was the question of how their story would be remembered. The fall chill settled over Washington, D.C. in November of 2011. A group of very old men in dark suits gathered beneath the great dome of the Capitol. They moved slowly now, some with canes, a few in wheelchairs pushed by grandchildren. These were the surviving Nisei soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Private Fred Shiosaki had flown in from Spokane. For this day, Congress struck a single gold medal, weighing 1.5 pounds, engraved with a line of infantrymen advancing with fixed bayonets. The men who once crawled through the Vosges forest and scaled the Gothic line took their seats to receive it. Many faces were missing from the assembly. Sergeant Katsugo Miho would have attended as the founder of the 442nd Veterans Club, but he had died just 2 months earlier in Honolulu, an old senator with one empty sleeve visiting his bedside. Private Rudy Tokiwa was gone too. His relentless voice finally stilled after decades of pain from the shrapnel he carried since Monte Folgorito. The men who lifted their medals from the velvet boxes felt the weight of their absent brothers pressing down on the chamber. The joy in the room was real, but it was a quiet joy. It was shadowed by the silence of empty chairs. A young congressional staffer read aloud the citations that had taken 70 years to compile. The 442nd fought with an unmatched ferocity. They earned 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and more than 4,000 Purple Hearts. Every number spoken in that dome represented a friend who had screamed for a medic in the dark. Every decoration represented a mother who had prayed over cold water in a desert camp. The gold medal passed into the hands of the old soldiers, and they simply nodded. They had never needed a medal to know what they had done. 7 months later, the scene shifted to the East Room of the White House. It was May 29, 2012. President Barack Obama stepped up to a podium before an embroidered gold curtain and prepared to bestow the highest civilian honor in the nation. The recipient was not a general or a diplomat. He was a man who had spent his youth in a jail cell, convicted of violating a curfew imposed on his own people. Gordon Hirabayashi had died 4 months earlier in Edmonton, Alberta, at the age of 93. His widow, Susan Carnahan, sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. The president grew solemn as he spoke the citation. He described the young Quaker student who had walked into an FBI office in 1942 to turn himself in. He described a man who refused to register for an exclusion order because he believed the Constitution meant what it said, that no citizen should lose their rights because of their ancestry. The president paused and looked out at the audience. Hirabayashi's own words rose in the room, spoken by the commander-in-chief with deliberate clarity. Unless citizens are willing to stand up for the Constitution, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Susan Carnahan rose and walked slowly to the podium. She accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom on behalf of her husband, the blue ribbon and gold star heavy in her hands. The applause that filled the East Room was not merely for one man. It was for the principle that a single citizen armed only with a moral conviction can bend the arc of an empire. Hirabayashi had never sought glory. He had simply believed in the law even when the law had failed him. The medal was the nation's confession that he had been right all along. Back across the Atlantic, on a dusty road in northern Italy, a different kind of ceremony had been taking place for decades. Local villagers from Tendola and Azzano still placed flowers at the stone markers where young Nisei soldiers had fallen. In the town of Bruyères in France, they called the 442nd the saviors of the Vosges and still spoke their names in the schools. The medals and the monuments were the public record. But the legacy of the go-for-broke spirit burned brightest in the quiet places, in a widow's hand accepting a long-delayed honor, in a Hawaiian judge buried at the punch bowl, in a retired chemist fly fishing on a Washington lake. Rudy Tokiwa had died on December 4, 2004, but his ghost haunted every redress hearing for years afterward. The last words he spoke in public came from a wheelchair when he could no longer stand. He told a room of teenagers that the real lesson of the 442nd was simple. It doesn't make no difference what you look like, he said. It's what you've done for the country that counts. His partner Judy Niyazawa still kept a photograph of him from the day he received his Bronze Star in Empoli, a young man limping on wounded legs, his chest out, his eyes fierce. Fred Shiosaki lived on. He moved to a retirement home in Seattle after his beloved Lily passed away on the 4th of July in 2016. His son Michael tended the enormous pumpkins that Fred once gave to neighborhood children every Halloween. On quiet mornings, Fred still drove east to the lakes his father Kisaburo had first shown him as a boy in the Great Depression. He cast his line into the same cold water and watched the mist lift off the pines. The war still visited him occasionally in the hours before dawn, but he had made a peace with it. He had outlived the anger. Susumu Ito, the artillery mechanic who carried his mother's 1,000-stitch belt throughout the European campaign, passed away at 96 in Boston. The belt now rests in a glass case at the Japanese-American National Museum in Los Angeles, the red silk stitches still vivid after 80 years. George Oye, the Montana farm boy who lost his hearing during the Lost Battalion bombardment, died in 2006 and was buried near the forests where he once hunted with his father. Chaplain Hiro Higuchi, who had wept beside too many foxholes, went to his rest on Kauai in 1981. The orchids a fellow chaplain once hybridized blooming on the Big Island for decades afterward. Sadao Munamori, the first Japanese-American to receive the Medal of Honor, had thrown himself on a grenade to save his comrades. His mother accepted the award in 1946, a solitary acknowledgement for a generation of valor. The story of the 442nd does not belong only to the men who wore the patch. It belongs to the families who saved their blue service stars, the mothers who poured cold water over their bodies at Poston, the fathers who shook their sons' hands and said simply, "You did well." It belongs to a young resistor named Gordon Hirabayashi, a child of immigrants who demanded that America keep its promise. The final legacy of the go-for-broke generation is not a monument or a statistic. It is a permanent lesson that loyalty is not proven by surrender to injustice, but by the willingness to fight for the highest ideals of a nation, even when it has failed you. If you have a family story or a personal memory from the era of the 442nd and the incarceration camps, we would be honored to read it in the comments below. Your recollections keep this history alive in a way that no book ever can. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support more historical documentaries on the forgotten corners of the American story. Thank you for listening.